Good evening and welcome to the Connolly branch of the Boston Public Library. My name is Emily Todd. I'm one of the librarians at the Connolly branch, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Before I introduce our speakers, I just have a few housekeeping items for all of you who are joining us via Zoom. Subtitles and closed captioning can be turned on or off by using the closed captioning or live transcript button. Tonight's talk is being recorded and will be made available on the library's YouTube page. You can ask questions at any time during the program. Just click on the Q&A button below and we'll be doing a question and answer session following the discussion. Tonight's talk is the third annual Labor History Month lecture presented by the Connolly branch. This series started in 2020 with Nick Jurovich of UMass, and last year featured labor journalist Kim Gelly. And I'm so delighted to be joined by our speakers tonight. So our speakers tonight are Aviva Chomsky and Steve Striffler. Aviva is a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American studies at Salem State University. She works on labor history, migration, and global economic inequality. In addition to organizing for power, her recent books include Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration, and Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. Steve Striffler is director of the Labor Resource Center and professor of anthropology at UMass Boston. He writes about labor, the left, food, and immigration in relation to Latin America and the United States. He is the author of Chicken, The Dangerous Transformation of America's Favorite Food, and more recently, Solidarity, Latin America and the US Left in the Era of Human Rights. Welcome, Aviva and Steve, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'm going to start, right? Is that the plan? Okay. Yeah, no, thanks so much, Emily, and the folks at the Connolly branch of the Boston Public Library for organizing this series. Obviously, we're thrilled that there is a series on labor history and excited to be here. I think we thought we'd start maybe with me talking a little bit about the book's origins and content, kind of like in a broad sense, and then Avi's going to dive a little bit more into the historical, substantive material and argument, I think in a general, in a way. And then we're hoping there'll be questions. We're really hoping there will be questions, and that we can just have a discussion about all things labor and working people kind of in Boston, Massachusetts, New England. And that's kind of the topic of the book. I think it's clear, but this is a book that Avi and I edited, so most of the individual chapters are written by other scholars and labor activists and leaders. The book itself came out of a conference that the two of us organized through the Labor Resource Center at UMass Boston, which, as was mentioned, I'm the director of. For those who don't know, maybe just a plug here, each of the UMass campuses actually has a labor center. The one at Boston is the home to the undergraduate major in labor studies. We also do labor education for labor unions, other folks in the labor movement. We also do policy type research. And then we also host the Boston Labor Conference every spring. We've done it for about 7 years or so. And the basic idea is to bring together labor-friendly scholars with labor leaders and activists to discuss sort of a theme that we think is important for the labor movement. For example, this past year, we just had a conference a few weeks ago that looked at kind of the recent wave of organizing around kind of high profile companies like Amazon, Starbucks, Trader Joe's. So that's kind of the broader framework. And this particular book came out of one of those conferences. And it looks I think in broad terms at kind of the past and present of labor and working class people in Boston and Massachusetts and sort of New England as well. But collectively, the book took kind of as its point of departure another book, a short book by James Green and Hugh Donoghue called Boston Workers, A Labor History, which was actually published by the Boston Public Library in 1979. And we had the authors read it, I think, because we think it's really good. Also, maybe in part, Jim founded the Labor Resource Center at UMass and is also kind of a giant within the field of labor history. But I think maybe mainly because it was published in 1979. And I think, and Avi's going to talk more about this, but that we thought that kind of the 70s, 80s represented sort of a key moment and turning point for Boston labor and working people, kind of in the US in general, but certainly within Boston taking a particular path that looks a little different than some other parts of the country. So our book then, not surprisingly, has an introduction. And it's written by Avi and myself that looks at kind of the major structural changes impacting labor and working people. There it is in live. Looks at sort of structural changes, but also the place of organized labor in all of this, and also the place of kind of precarious labor, folks that aren't organized, thinking about that in relation to the recent history of Boston and the region, but also particularly, I think, through the lens of race and immigration. And Avi's going to talk more about this in a minute. The book then opens with kind of three broad looks at Boston labor. There's a first chapter that focuses really kind of on the data of inequality and how it got worse after the Great Recession. That is, it was really bad before the Great Recession, and then inequality even got increasingly worse kind of during that period, and we can certainly talk about why. Then also kind of how key public sector and public sector unions are kind of in this region in particular, but also like looking at the struggles they faced kind of during recent decades and sort of their place within the labor movement. And then finally, in that first section, a chapter that actually Avi wrote on the history of Boston's changing Black working class and kind of the struggle for racial and economic justice. So those are three sort of broad framing kinds of chapters. And then the rest of the book are a series of case studies that look at really kind of at the struggles of different groups of workers for the most part. There's one on workers in Lynn that we can talk about. I think it's quite interesting interview, really, but a case study. Struggles of university cafeteria workers at area universities, similar chapter on non-tenure track faculty at area universities. Let's see, efforts to organize immigrant workers largely through worker centers. And then as well as looking at fights to get more women in the building trades and also to organize and defend sex workers. So there's a lot there. There's hopefully something for everyone. I will say, I think one of the nice things about the book, or maybe one of the nice things about editing the book, but I think it's also one of the nice things about the book, is it was written by, a mix, as I sort of mentioned about the conference does this, but the book does it too, a mix of kind of labor-friendly scholars that have a foot in the labor movement, and then also labor leaders and activists that like to write and think about these things as well. And just as an example, I think there's a really nice chapter by Carlos Arameo, who's the president of Unite Here, Local 2060, and he does really a nice job of showing how Boston's economy, which has become sort of a information biotech reliant type of economy, how that's created, a lot of really, not a lot, a small number of really rich people, but also then kind of a professional class that itself does pretty well, but that depends on a service sector that employs a large class of folks that aren't doing particularly well. And then he looks, more specifically at the plight of food service workers at area universities and their efforts to turn those jobs into good unionized jobs as a way of kind of surviving and thriving, hopefully in a very expensive region that's made those services necessary, but difficult for those groups of people to even exist in some ways around the city. So anyway, it gives you a sense of the book. And I think Avi now is going to talk a little bit about kind of how things to a certain extent have changed in the Boston labor movement and for working people since probably that period of when we take as the point of departure Jim Green's book and its publication in '79, so the 70s and 80s. So I'll leave it there, Avi.
Okay, great summary there. Thank you, Steve. I came back to Boston in 1997 after several decades of living away from Massachusetts, which is where I'm also from. And one of the things that struck me the most and that I'm still kind of struggling with, and that we definitely struggled with in this book, is thinking about how Massachusetts as a state and Boston as a city have a reputation for being extremely blue and extremely liberal, but that when you kind of dig down, it's a very contradictory, the realities of Boston, and especially how Boston politics work and Massachusetts politics work, don't necessarily match that reputation. And the Boston Globe did a series, I think it was in 2017, called Boston Racism, Myth and Reality, talking about how despite its liberal reputation, Boston has this other reputation as being the most racist city in the United States. And how extraordinarily difficult it's been in Massachusetts to get progressive legislation passed, despite the supposedly progressive nature of the state, and some of the institutions that and ways that the history has created this contradictory situation. So that's one thing that was on my mind as we were getting started with the book and with the Boston Labor Conference. And the other thing that really came clear to me in this first Boston Labor Conference was, and kind of along the same lines, both how the gap between Boston's traditional labor movement and what some people call, and we in the book also call, alt labor, the extent to which the traditional movement, and the Green Book talks about this a little bit also. So let me just go back to the history, but mentioning that Boston, as compared to other major cities, really had very little heavy industry. And if you know anything about the history of the US labor movement, the AFL, American Federation of Labor, started as a craft union. And then in the mid-20th century, the CIO was created as an industrial union and tended to be much, the craft union tradition was one of, that's sometimes called fortress unionism, of trying to improve the situation of members, and in some ways create a privileged class of workers, a privileged unionized class of workers, whereas the CIO philosophy was much more aimed at what we would today perhaps call social movement unionism, the idea of organizing for the working class. The CIO was much more interested in challenging racism and being a multiracial union movement, whereas the AFL unions tended to be quite protective of their borders and often trying to create like union families, which meant that they were exclusive of people who were not already part of the union movement. So that Boston, with its much smaller sector of heavy industry, had a much smaller CIO presence, which meant that the AFL and the more sort of conservative wing of the union movement, and of course they merged in 1955, but that Boston's union movement had a history of being a little more conservative and exclusionary, exclusivist, and yet the entire union movement also in the 1970s, 1970s and 80s were, as Steve said, really key decades. The 1970s is when we first start seeing major deindustrialization and major corporate attacks on unions. And deindustrialization is one part, I think, of the corporate attacks on unions. But so we see a big decline in union density in the country and also in Boston during the decade of the 1970s. And this is exactly at the same time as we see a new influx of immigrants into the United States, especially from Latin America and Asia, due in part to the 1965 new immigration law that really opened up immigration to Latin Americans and Asians for the first time. And we also see struggles for civil rights and desegregation. So all of these things are going on just as deindustrialization is going on and unions are under attack. So how are unions to respond? Sometimes defensively with this idea of fortress unionism, like we don't really want to desegregate, we want to preserve the privileges, we don't want to allow immigration, we're not very interested in immigrants. So this is sort of one wing of what's going on. And then on the other hand, we have a growing union movement, both within the traditional labor movement and outside the traditional labor movement of what we could call alt labor, what's now being called alt labor. Things bringing back the idea of social movement unionism, and that rather than protecting the privileges of our members, we need to organize for the entire working class. And that includes the people of color who make up a good portion of the working class, new immigrants who are coming in to this sort of declining industrial society. The last time there was such a large wave of immigration was in the late 19th and early 20th century, when industrialization was booming and there was a huge demand for immigrant labor. In the new economy of the late 20th century, there's also a huge demand for labor, but not in industry because of deindustrialization. Another thing that's happening, and we see this in Massachusetts, we call it the Massachusetts miracle of the 1980s, and Steve also referred to this as the growth of a new set of industries, not heavy industries, not really production industries, but higher education, technical fields, that tend to not be unionized, especially higher education, and tend to be a more privileged sector of the labor force. But this explosion of the high tech and biotech sector also brings the need for immigrant workers, workers in the lower levels of the economy who are excluded. I mean, they get jobs, but they're excluded from a lot of the privileges and benefits that this economy brings. Now, at the same time, another thing that's really specific about Boston is its relationship with the metro Boston area. Boston's actually quite a small city, geographically speaking. And outside of Boston, we have this sort of bifurcation of leafy, mostly white suburbs that grew in the post-World War II period through a series of federal policies, but also through white flight from the cities, especially during school desegregation. And then we have gateway cities, which are the formerly industrial cities like Lawrence and Lowell and Lynn, the three L's, that are called gateway cities that are really impoverished by the deindustrialization and don't really experience the Massachusetts miracle. So we have a quite divided labor force. And one of the things that was exciting about this first conference and subsequent conferences and seeing what's happening with the labor movement is seeing how the traditional organized labor movement is trying to remake itself in this new context, and trying to reach out to workers who have traditionally been excluded from Boston's labor movement and Massachusetts's, and really the AFL-CIO in general in the previous decades. And just a couple of the ways that that we saw this happening at the conference and continuing to happen around us, and that some of the chapters in the book deal with. One is worker centers that try to organize workers outside of the workplace, especially people who work in the informal sector or the precarious sector of the economy, who don't necessarily all work for the same employer, so can't really be organized in the basis of the employer, but who are some of the most marginalized members of the workforce, and frequently people who work, say, in landscaping, newspaper delivery, domestic labor, house cleaning, and who are very frequently work in subcontracted sectors and are victims of things like wage theft, lack of overtime payment, lack of benefits. And the worker centers really try to organize on multiple levels to help protect workers' rights, workers who are not organizable in many ways in traditional unions. A second thing that some of the more traditional unions have been involved in is, and we see this especially, I would say, in the teachers union, but also other unions, service sector unions, the concept of bargaining for the common good, that we want, that the goal of the union is not just to protect the privileges of its members, but to seek the good of the entire working class. And some of the battles of the teachers unions over charter schools, for example, to protect public education, which is something that's in the interest of the entire working class, not just higher wages for the individuals, although that's also part of bargaining, but going beyond that to bargain for the common good. And finally, moving beyond the workplace into the legislative sphere and trying to push for legislation that protects the working class, raising the minimum wage, for example, or when, as is sometimes the case in Massachusetts, the legislative process is simply too much of its own fortress to work through, and we can talk about some of the ways that this has happened, through ballot questions, through bringing it to the public. And the most recent great success of the labor movement was the passage last year of the Fair Share Amendment that is trying to rebalance the struggle between labor and capital by increasing taxes on the wealthy. And Massachusetts actually has a very regressive tax structure, one of the unusual things for such a supposedly progressive state. But the Fair Share Amendment raised taxes on people earning over $1 million a year. But interestingly, with the way our legislative system works, both our liberal Democratic governor and our overwhelmingly Democratic legislature is trying to kind of counteract what we gained with the Fair Share Amendment by reducing taxes on the wealthy, with the argument that if we tax them too much, they'll leave the state and we won't get any taxes from them. So the struggle is ongoing. Union density is, despite all of the recent and some successful organizing that's been going on, union density is continues, is barely holding its ground, down from over a third of the labor force in the heyday of labor, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, down to approximately 12%, and in the private sector, only 6%. So it shows you some of the struggles that that labor is facing, and inequality in Massachusetts, and the high cost of living in Massachusetts, and the gap between what people are able to earn, especially working class people are able to learn, and what it takes to live in Boston and Massachusetts, is a huge challenge and struggle facing us. So I will end there. I think I talked longer than I was supposed to, but we'd love to take some questions.
So looks like our first question is from an anonymous attendee, and it's, how have unions in the healthcare industry affected this evolution of traditional labor and alt labor?
Do you want me to start? We can each say something about that, I think.
Sure, go for
Go
it.
ahead. Yeah.
So one issue that has been a big issue in Massachusetts in terms of bargaining for the common good is staffing levels. That is, how many patients are nurses required to take care of in a given time period. And of course, this is an important labor issue for the nurses in terms of the sort of increasing stress and demands on the job. sort of the contemporary version of the speed up, which, where workers are asked to work faster and faster and tend more and more machines and produce more and more. But the same thing is happening in the healthcare sector. But this is also, like what I mentioned with the schools, a question of bargaining for the common good, because it's not good for patients either if the nurses are stretched too thin and stressed and not able to provide patients with the care that they need. The healthcare sector is also, I think, divided between the more formal healthcare sector and the more informal healthcare sector, especially home healthcare. And the attempts to find ways to organize home healthcare workers have been a very important way to reach beyond that division. And those, so to say, can workers who work for the who are paid by Medicare be considered a bargaining unit, and can they be brought together to fight for higher wages? Can workers who work for particular staffing companies be considered a bargaining unit, and can they be brought together? And in the case of home health care, often can the people who they take care of, and there's a really interesting case in Chinatown where many of the home health care workers work for people within their own community. Can we create alliances between the people who are being taken care of and the people who are doing the care to demand better conditions? But certainly within home health care, I think this is one place where you see both labor and alt labor sort of working together. And we also see just how difficult it is to organize in the sort of subcontracting and fragmented and precarious economy we have.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add maybe one thing on that too is, I mean, also I feel like both nurses and teachers have done like a really good job on kind of this bargaining for a common good front, like in the sense of like framing it, I think in quite successful ways for the public, like in general, like in the sense of like nurses, particularly around St. Vincent's strike, were really good about, yeah, this is about staffing. You're all going to need us at some point. We're going to be in a hospital and we want adequate staffing when we come in as patients. And so it's not, it's not fun. It's not just about, in fact, I think if you looked at this across the country, the staffing was always the #1 issue for nurses in recent kind of strikes. And in part because hospitals and medical facilities are now owned by some of the largest corporations in the world. And then I think teachers have done a really good job framing it in similar terms for theirs. But despite this, like that, it hasn't led to, like, even within like the core of the union movement for nursing, it's still, these struggles have been brutal and nasty. And these are corporations that really are not playing by the rules in the sense of coming to the negotiating table and negotiating in good faith, but are really looking in many cases, particularly within nursing, not so much within education, but to get rid of the union. And so that makes it, I think that sends a message and makes it all the more difficult for more precarious workers within these sectors to organize. I mean, and that's sort of the broader, I think, landscape that workers are facing.
And, I think the issue of the public sector is also a complicated one. You said maybe not so much for teachers. And obviously, the public sector is where unions have been able to hold on and be successful much more. But the public sector has really been subject to austerity because the same kind of politics that is leading to the corporatization of healthcare is starving the public sector. And this goes back to the Fair Share Amendment and the tax issue. And what we're hearing at the federal level now too about balancing the budget. But just as third world governments that might want to sustain or even increase public services, but are not able to because of debt and because they're not able to raise taxes on the wealthy and powerful. The United States is really in something of a similar situation right now, where the ability to collect tax revenues from corporations and the wealthy and powerful, and the issue of the debt is being used to cut public services and to privatize, which of course is another way of increasing corporate profits as well.
I feel like that your answer is like made a nice little segue into a question we have, which is what trends do you note for public worker unions in Massachusetts? And I mean, Avi, do you want to start with that since
Sure. I mean, the public sector is under attack, and it's under attack in a number of ways. One thing that I see happening at my own university is how much of what used to be direct employment by our university is being contracted out to corporations. So that our food service now is provided by a multinational conglomerate of food service companies. Everything that can be contracted out. I mean, I've seen this happen just in the time that I've been teaching at this public university, is that the university itself the university itself is under stress because the state portion of our budget goes down every year, so that we can almost not even be called a public university now because the public sector provides so little for us. But at the same time, we are contracting out more and more things so that fewer and fewer people are working directly for the university. And we don't even have to talk about the MBTA, right? But this is part of the neoliberal era. And I think part of the reason for the big attack on the public sector is that it's an attack on labor. Because the public sector has been a sort of a protected bastion for the labor movement, where it's been able to hold on to some of the gains for working people that were made over the course of the 20th century, and that now are in the 21st century are just sort of hanging on tooth and nail.
I mean, and maybe just to add a little bit to that too, I think the aversion in some ways, or a close cousin of subcontracting is certainly, and we're seeing this, I think certainly UMass Boston, but it's happening in other words, it's just as state funding decreases and we're more and more reliant on student tuition, of course, that's horrible for students, and it's making the university kind of unaffordable in many ways for the folks that we're supposed to serve. But it also there's just like a continual, almost like a never-ending search for ways to cut costs. And increasingly, I think for us, that means just a growing reliance on non-tenure track, what some folks might, I think, refer to kind of as adjunct faculty that are not paid particularly well, do not have security, and that are now like just relied on institutionally and are just a fundamental part of the university's kind of financial structure, in a way that it's sort of difficult to see how one walks back from that and gets back to something sort of more sustainable, in which you have faculty that are properly paid and resourced. But I mean, and that's not sort of just in the public sector. I think everyone's familiar with that too, of the private sector is quite good at doing that as well, but it's increased certainly as a percentage, I think at universities probably across the board, certainly at UMass Boston.
And one of the things that the MSCA, my statewide state university union, representing State University faculty, has been doing over the past couple of years is the debt reveal, trying to look at the extent to which the public universities are running not only on raising tuition, but also on debt, but that it's like we're all third world countries now, because debt is a profit-making enterprise, right? So the universities are indebted and they are trapped in austerity and paying interest on their loans. And that's one of the reasons that they're having to raise tuition, which puts students into debt, which means that banks and lenders and the financial sector is making money off of all of this.
All right, and our next question is from Marjorie. What is your analysis of the impact of 9 to 5, the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers, and other organizing drives among white collar, pink collar workers on the situation of labor in the Boston area or Massachusetts?
Go ahead.
Okay, I mean, what's our analysis? So 9 to 5 is great. I think for folks that don't know, I'm sure maybe people do, but in a simple sense, 9 to 5 was a Boston-based or Boston origin effort among exclusively, I think, women clerical workers in the 1970s. And I think in some ways, was kind of, I don't, this is maybe overstating it, but was sort of the original alt labor. To a certain extent, I think of it that way, in the sense that it was, they recognized and were committed to organizing as a union. And that is, they saw the need for a union to get union type things like better wages, job descriptions, benefits, and these were folks that were getting paid horrifically at the time. I think they also recognized that a lot of problems they were facing in work. Well, I think they recognize two things. One, that the unions might not be immediately embrace them because they kind of look different and were different from traditional, the idea of traditional labor, certainly during the 1970s. And then I think also they recognized that collective bargaining and negotiating sort of at the table in the ways that unions traditionally have done might not address all of the concerns that they were facing, which in a broad sense, I would just describe as a culture of sexism in the workplace. And how do you sort of address those things? I mean, they can be done through collective contractings, but it's also addressing a broader set of cultural issues that women were facing kind of during that period. And clearly all those things are still there in a sense, I mean, for that sector, but also I think of it as sort of, I guess it's an example of that was going on certainly during the 70s, and it was going on within women in other sectors as well, is how do we organize, recognition that the labor movement, in order to survive and thrive and not be just doing defensive struggles, has to organize sectors that have not traditionally been organized. And that was, I think it was its fundamental contribution in a sense of raising that issue and raising that profile as being the fundamental issue for the labor movement going forward, and one that we still haven't been able to address for a variety of reasons, and not just for women, but for workers in all sorts of sectors that aren't traditionally organized. I'll just stop there, Avi, and let you jump in.
I don't know if I have a whole lot to add to what you say. I think you kind of covered it, but I guess I did also just want to mention that, early union struggles in the United States, there were a lot of women workers during the early years of union struggles in the late 19th century United States, textile workers. Some of the research that I've done here in Salem among women textile workers, and who were kind of struggling with the same issues. That is, the union was dominated by Irish men, and the vast majority of the workers were French Canadian and Polish recent immigrant young women workers. And so they were struggling not only against the company, but also against their own union for their rights as workers, because the union had developed very close relations with the company. It wasn't exactly a company union, it was an AFL union, but but I think that this, the sort of heyday of the union movement of the mid 20th century, where we think about, and through the 1970s and the attacks of the 1970s, was kind of based on the idea of a male breadwinner and a family wage. And that was part of how union struggles were framed. And so, thinking about people who are outside that framework, and thinking about 9 to 5 as like a kind of a precursor to today's alt labor, I think is really useful.
Our next question is from Arthur. And Arthur's asking, in Massachusetts, how much of the decline of union density is due to the changing industrial structure? And how much has there been a decline of density in industries that were previously unionized? Do we know?
That sounds like a question from Arthur McEwen, an economist. and we're not economists. I don't know, Avi, you want to take a stab at it?
I mean, I can't give you an exact number, but I would say that both are happening simultaneously. And if we just look at, say, General Electric, they have lost significant union density within that company. But at the same time, the company has hugely downsized and outsourced a lot of its production. So, so they're almost, I mean, I would say both are the result of the sort of sustained corporate drive to reduce labor's share of their profits and increase management's share of the profits that characterizes the neoliberal era. So they're almost like two sides of the same coin. But certainly, studies that have been done, like by Kate Bronfenbrenner, have shown the extent to which the threat of outsourcing, the threat of closing down and moving overseas, which is perceived accurately as a real threat by workers, is raised in like 90% of union organizing drives, that workers are threatened with, that the company's just going to leave if you try to bring in a union. And even in some of these newer campaigns in other non-manufacturing sectors like Starbucks, we see them making good on that threat. They say, we're going to close down this store, and what does Starbucks care? They have another one on the next block. So when one unionizes, they are just closing down. So part of the problem is that the legal structures and bureaucracy are so tilted and increasingly tilted away from labor and towards management. So the system of union elections, where it's really hard to go through all the steps to even get a union election. And once that has happened, that doesn't mean you've won. That means you're just beginning the battle, because in so many union elections, and we really see this happening in the new sectors that we've been talking about, even if the workers do manage to win an election, the status quo remains, unless the company decides to make good on their threat to close, which they do, which they have done in many cases. But the workers don't start to see any benefits until a contract is signed. And in so many cases, and the law basically backs up the employer, they can make it impossible to ever sign a contract. And again, this is what we're seeing in some of these sectors like Amazon, Trader Joe's, Starbucks, that workers finally win an election, and then the company simply refuses to negotiate, or only will negotiate in the most pro forma manner. And yes, the union can file an unfair labor practice, but while all of this is going on, there's no contract. And in the meantime, in many of these sectors, and especially when they're not unionized, there's also very high turnover among the workers. So if a year passes, then management can call for the union to be decertified. And there's never been a contract, and nobody's ever gotten any benefit from the organizing drive.
That sounds good. That was good.
So our next question is from Anonymous, who is asking us to take out our crystal balls, and their question is, can you talk more about the conflicts between labor and alt labor and predict the future?
Oh, that's my least favorite question. I'm a historian. I hate to predict the future. I'll just say why I hate to predict the future while Steve composes an answer to that question. But I feel like there's so many unknowns. We don't even know how the city of Boston is going to redistrict for the next city council elections, much less do we know who's going to win the next national elections, or even who's going to run in the next national elections, although many of us have a suspicion. There's just too many unknowns and too many things that surprises that can happen. Like, we didn't predict that COVID was coming, and then it came. So I'm really hesitant to ever try to rely on my crystal ball. I don't know, Steve, if you have anything
Well, do you want
to offer?
Do you want to speak to the, I'll say something, but do you want to speak to the other part of the question, which was talking about conflicts between, I think, organized labor and alt labor? Not so much with not so much thinking about predicting the future, maybe, but just in terms of like maybe the recent history of that and where that might be going.
Well, I'll say something about the recent history, but I'm going to where it might be going to you. I think that increasingly we're seeing the traditional labor movement becoming more and more open to alt labor, and realizing that in order to survive and in order to achieve any of labor's goals, we have to increase mobilization, and whether it's directly union density or other kinds of mobilization, and that we have to fight back against the ways that working people are under severe attack in almost all sectors, political, economic, social, even in blue states like Massachusetts. So, I think there are probably some individuals in traditional labor who are a little more resistant to change and are more interested in just sort of sitting back on their laurels. But I think they're pretty much a small minority, although perhaps a vocal minority. And that most of the traditional labor movement is very eager to find ways to operate in this new economic and political climate that we're faced with.
Yeah, that was kind of my first reaction too, is when I was thinking like the question framed as a conflict. My own sense is like there are ongoing tensions within the labor movement, maybe less than rising to the conflict on that dimension. And I do think pretty much like almost everyone, it seems like within the mainstream labor movement certainly recognizes the need to organize beyond the workplace and beyond the traditional boundaries of like particular unions. And I think getting back to sort of a comment Avi mentioned earlier, that they recognize in a sense that defensive struggles are not enough. Like they're important, right? In the sense that you do as a union have to struggle to keep your members, your benefits for your members, your wages for your members, all the gains in a sense that those unions have made. On the other hand, I think they also recognize that even if maybe they're not committing enough resources to organizing, and I think that's a valid sort of, criticism, but that they recognize they have to organize new folks, not only within their sector, maybe of the economy, but beyond that. Because if you continue to lose union density, then it's going to be really difficult to maintain the gains you have within your little fortress at work. And my sense is most within the labor movement recognize that, and also recognize that that needs to include all sectors of alt labor, which maybe we traditionally think of as women and people of color, but I think it's much more kind of broader than that as well. So I think there's like a commitment to internal organizing and external organizing. I actually think like a good chapter, if I can plug the book, that talks about that is the interview that Avi has with Jeff, just in the sense that 201, I think Jeff's not here. I think he would probably say they sort of got their butts kicked over the long period of time, but did like a phenomenally good job, or a good example of a union that was consistently committed to organizing internally and doing kind of what that took, but also simultaneously organizing externally, like beyond the bounds of the traditional boundaries of kind of the union, in a way that embraced, I think, like a combination of traditional unionism with sort of almost like what we think of maybe as alt labor, but certainly like social movement unionism in the broader sense. And like that chapter, I think, is a great example in the book of kind of that, like what that means in the future. I'm reluctant to take that on because I'm not optimistic, like in the sense that, I think one thing we can probably predict is that like union density may continue to decline. The Democrats will continue to disappoint us. In the sense of, I think one of the things Avi talked about was, is just how difficult it is to form a union, and then to get a contract, to force the company to the negotiating table, And I think we were hopeful that the PRO Act might get through, and we're hopeful every time I think a new Democratic president comes to office that there will be this legislative package that makes it easier for workers to organize. I think we have to keep struggling for that, but I also, if I had to predict the future, they'll probably disappoint us again. But those are the kinds of struggles I think that are certainly important, but I won't try to predict the future either.
Let me just say one more thing, now that we're on the topic. I don't know if there was an implication in the question, or even as in my own beginnings of answer to the question, that somehow alt labor knows something that traditional labor doesn't know. And I don't think that's really the case. We've been talking about the struggles facing organized labor, and the weaknesses of organized labor, but alt labor is even weaker than organized labor. I think there are heroic efforts being made on all sides, but that the structural and political forces arrayed against working people are so enormous that it's an uphill battle, and nobody knows the answer. It's not like we know what we should be doing and we're just not doing it. We don't know, and neither traditional labor nor alt labor. And that's why at the beginning I was talking about some of the experimentation that's been going on. The concept of bargaining for the common good, moving into the legislative arena. But I wanted to say something about immigrant workers who, in many ways, and especially undocumented workers, who have even more structural forces arrayed against them, and who I think tend to be quite fearful of their status, and unlikely to be connected to a union or to political campaigns for obvious reasons, and much more likely to just not want to make waves, because under US law, it's really difficult for them to work, and they're completely vulnerable to their employers because of the 1986 legislation that that makes it that disallows the employment and the continued pushes to force employers to document the legal status of all of their workers. So, the AFL-CIO was quite slow to sort of step on the bandwagon of recognizing the rights of undocumented workers and there's sort of two ways that a citizen or a union can respond to this. And one is to say, well, undocumented workers are a threat, so they should all be deported. And the other is to say, well, undocumented workers are a threat, so it shouldn't be illegal to employ undocumented workers, because that's what enables employers to use undocumented workers in their race to the bottom. So granting more rights to undocumented workers would be good for all workers, because it would stop this race to the bottom that's going on inside the United States, or at least that particular aspect of the race to the bottom that's going on inside the United States. It's going on in many different ways. But the political climate, nobody knows how to protect the rights of immigrants in today's political climate. And it just seems to be getting worse and worse, regardless of whether we have a Democrat or a Republican in office. And, we just all have so much education and consciousness raising and mobilizing to do, whether within the labor movement or outside the labor movement. But, the politics of this country right now is just really the politics and economics of this country right now are really unfavorable to working people.
Next question is, how do you see the work in the chapter about getting more women into union construction fitting into the larger themes you've mentioned?
I think I stab at it. No, that's a good question. I mean, I think it is right. I mean, I think in that case, right, that's a chapter about efforts by, and in some ways, my predecessor Susan Moyer, who to open up the building trades to more women. I think particularly women of color, but women in general, and give right and in a sense, I mean, I think part of what we were talking about, right, is bringing workers that have not traditionally been in the union fold, giving them access to good unionized jobs, and certainly that's something. Right. I mean, Avi was talking about sort of the AFL tradition of kind of and sort of almost family tradition of protecting jobs for particular sectors of workers that often generally did not include women, often didn't include people of color. But that's certainly, I mean, I think that's how I would situate kind of that broader effort. And they've had, and I think if you read the chapter, they've been, actually relatively successful, but it's still, I mean, I think it's still sort of an uphill battle. And then of course, right. And that's a sector that that is in some ways like is heavily unionized, but also is certainly also, and I think that shapes its politics to a certain extent, certainly feels the threats from non-unionized folks within that sector of the economy, right? And so that's the ongoing tension, I think, there is like you're bringing women into the unionized component, but there's also a vast sort of number of people that are working within those trades that are not unionized, and sort of how does that affect the sort of broader kind of dynamic? But I don't know, that's my initial sort of take and how I sort of see it.
And Joe asks, how are we in Massachusetts doing as far as teaching people about what unions are and how they work? Without union member density and the militant left social movement organizers of the 1930s, where and what are kids/workers learning about organized labor?
We both know who asked that question.
I don't know. I mean, oh, well, I see. I mean, well, I could say that the labor centers at the University of Massachusetts are doing a great job of this. But that no, I mean that I mean, but I think the question, I mean, I think the question is hugely important, right? And it is framed in sort of not just about labor, but I often think of this in terms of the left, right? Is that as the left and labor, maybe I'll just overstate it a little bit, like as they disappear from public life, like how do you revive those sorts of traditions or sort of pass them on to kind of the next generation? And not just that, but also, right, it's the left and labor that need to be involved in public life because they should be framing the debates and how we think about the economy and who it should benefit for and all of the sorts of issues we've been kind of talking about. And as they sort of occupy a less prominent place within our worlds, then yeah, that I think is a really serious question. I mean, I think part of the difficulty is I think the labor movement itself, as small kind of, or as small as it's become, is still significant. But certainly doesn't, if there's a criticism to be made that they don't put enough effort into organizing, there's certainly a criticism to be made that they don't put enough effort into political education of their own members. And that's sort of like an ongoing, I think, issue for the labor movement. Almost every sector kind of faces that. I mean, I'm within education. I think that's true, like for the MTA. And they do, I think, a relatively good job. But that's sort of an issue. But then, I mean, even if you amped up efforts in that area, I still think the question, it wouldn't itself, right, be resolved because the unionized sector is so small. And that's, how do you get that? And I think we also feel as though at this moment, maybe not quite as much in Massachusetts, but that all forms of, I mean, it's certainly taken its more forms along kind of African-American history and questions of race, but is that it feels as though like progressive, what I think as truthful understandings of history are under attack kind of in a variety of ways throughout the United States, whether it's K through 12 or higher ed in different ways. And the intensity varies kind of depending on the state and the region, but you sort of are feeling that, I think, as well.
I would just add that, I mean, I think that public opinion surveys show that popular approval of unions and even workers' desire to be unionized is quite robust, is pretty high, higher than it's been in a long time. But at the same time, I think there's also really high levels of disillusionment and cynicism about politics in general and about the capacity for making change. And I remember talking to my students about like activism during the 1960s and like college students being mobilized on their campuses. And one student said, did they really think they could make change? Like, just so shocked with the idea that somebody could actually think that it was worth trying to bring about larger scale change. So I think that those two factors are kind of at war with each other in people's minds, the desire for change and the lack of confidence. And, every time there's a failure, like, a Starbucks closing or a year passing and a union being decertified without management ever sitting down to bargain, I think that just increases people's level of disillusionment and maybe hopelessness. But what you were saying about political education, I really think that has also been a very strong component of Local 201, and its strengths over the years has been in political education. And, Lynn is a really unusual town, and I think in large part because of the work that 201 has done there over the decades in terms of political activism and mobilization.
I also just want to add thing too. I don't often think of this as political education, but I mean, it's obvious in a sense that it is, but like efforts at bargaining for the common good are like political education in themselves, right? Because that on some level, I feel like the number one thing we should all be fighting for is an expansion of the public sector. I mean, an expansion of the public sector essentially means less profits are going to the hands of wealthy and corporations. And even if the public sector isn't working perfectly, that's better, especially if it's going to, education, healthcare, and I would include in the public sector, or we should include in the public sector, housing. And those kinds of arguments, I think that, that educators and nurses and all those folks are making. I don't often think of them as public education in that way, but that's probably in some ways the most important arguments to be making, or at least the ones I feel like are resonating right now with people that should be made and that unions are making.
Yeah, we have 2 questions left. Do we have time to answer the last 2 or?
Sure, why don't you ask them
Okay.
both? And
All right, so
Yeah,
the
it's up to
first
you.
one is, where do you see hopeful signs of progress in taking on racism within the labor movement? And the other one is from Harris, and they ask, how important will it be to find ways to organize and collectively bargain outside the NLRA structure for Uber and Lyft drivers, for example?
I'll take a quick stab at the second one, and think on the first one. Yeah, unless Avi, you want to jump in. I mean, I think like that question, the question about like organizing outside of like, well, I would say 2 things. One, it's hard. An important struggle is to make I think still, even though I'm not real hopeful, is to make the structure set up by the NLRA, reform it and make it work better for workers. Like that, like it's just so fundamental. And as Avi mentioned, there's 70% of people at least are favorable to unions, but man, when they try to organize, that sort of it squashes your enthusiasm because that structure is so set up against workers. I would also like, as far as the other part of the question, maybe I would say too, like I think legislative efforts are absolutely kind of key. Like I think particularly like around certain sectors of worker, and Uber and Lyft might sort of fall into that category, but they're really, I mean, Avi sort of mentioned this in the beginning, like it's kind of like on the one hand, like if you can't do it in Massachusetts, where can you do it, right? And yet these sorts of things just prove to be just so difficult with our legislature. And I think it requires, right, on some level, like a higher level of organizing to put a much greater degree of political pressure to put through the kinds of legislative initiatives we need, and I think the chapter in here by Harris, who was on this call about Raise Up Massachusetts, is a great example of sort of a successful sort of push for that, for a higher minimum wage. But we can imagine other ones in terms of, just defining workers and in the whole thing around independent contractors, worker classification, those kinds of things, housing, all sorts of things. But unless there is just a more robust level of organization kind of within the working class as a whole, it's hard to get those passed. And then, as Avi sort of pointed out earlier, it's hard to stop them from getting watered down in one way or the other after they're passed. And that's sort of an ongoing struggle, I think, for all of us, but certainly for the labor movement.
And I think that the question of the Uber and Lyft classification has been a really challenging one when it's been put on the ballot too, because the Uber and Lyft have so much money to spend on ballot questions and they just obfuscate the issue. And, a lot of my really pro-union friends in California didn't know how to vote because they were just confused by the barrage of propaganda they were subjected to. And they're people who are like politically conscious, and 90% of people aren't politically conscious. They're just subjected to the barrages of propaganda. So, we're going to be facing that here too, the question of classification of well, we're already facing it. But it's really hard to organize for labor rights outside of the NLRA process, but it's also really hard inside of the NLRA process. Unions making any progress on racism? You know, I would say yes, but again, the climate is not favorable to the kind of progress we need to see. And part of that is the climate of austerity and the feeling like, I mean, it's really hard to create solidarity when everybody is feeling so precarious. And, you know, I see a lot of this through the lens of anti-immigrant racism too. And just how difficult it is to, you know, it's partly a question of political consciousness, but it's also partly just a question of survival. And when people feel that their survival is threatened. So like we have to, and we haven't even talked about climate change, but there are so many urgent struggles, and it's like we have to be fighting them all at once. And we don't have a lot of power, and yet we just have to. So we will.
Maybe that's a good one to end on. It's sort of somewhat upbeat.
We have to do well. Well, thank you, Avi and Steve, so much for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure to hear from the two of you, and I have hope. I also want to thank everyone who joined us tonight, all our audience members, and of course Amanda from the AV department for her help. For folks who are watching this at a later date, you can pick up a copy of the book Organizing for Power at your local public library or independent bookstore. Thank you all and have a lovely evening.